Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some San Jose Sharks trade news. Of course, today was the first day of free agency, otherwise known as free agent frenzies, and there has been many signings around the league, including the Sharks themselves, who have made multiple today. However, this is not something I'm going to get into right away, and instead will be saved for tomorrow's video for the free agency recap, but instead I will be focusing on their trade that they made with the Florida Panthers, where the Sharks gave them Steven Lorentz and a 5th round pick in exchange for forward Anthony Duclair. Now, this is a pretty interesting trade from a Sharks perspective, but also one that might look a bit puzzling on the surface. This is because, for all intents and purposes, this is a cap dump move from the Florida Panthers. They are not getting a better player in this deal. They're going Duclair for Lorentz, which is objectively worse, which means the only real explanation from a Florida Panthers perspective is that they're trying to clear room to perhaps make an even bigger deal later on that will eventually end up making them a better team. And usually when it comes to these types of trades, these cap dump types of deal, the team that is getting rid of that big contract usually has to add in an additional asset. One trade that really comes to mind with a former San Jose Sharks player is when the Toronto Maple Leafs a few years ago had to trade him to the Carolina Hurricanes so that the Hurricanes will buy out his contract, and they had to give a first-round pick to Carolina for them to be able to do that. But even if not in those extreme cases of giving up a first-round pick, they're still giving up, seconds, thirds, perhaps half-decent prospects. But the thing about this trade is that not only do the Panthers not give up any additional assets with Duclair, but in fact it is the Sharks who give up the additional asset, because this is not a one-for-one trade, but the Sharks are also trading that 5th round pick in 2025. So some people might look at that and say, well, what is the point of this deal? Well, there is a very important detail about Anthony Duclair to mention, and that is that he has only 1 year remaining on his pretty affordable $3 million contract, especially when you can retain up to 50% of that. And so he is an unrestricted free agent at the end of the 23-24 season, meaning he is the primary candidate for a trade deadline deal. And the fact is that Duclair is a pretty good player. Obviously had his struggles this past season due to injury with the Florida Panthers, but a couple of seasons ago with the Panthers was an almost 60-point player with them. And that was, of course, an extremely good Panthers squad, and he's now coming to an extremely bad San Jose Sharks squad, so not necessarily expecting him to replicate that performance, but it should also be noted that he didn't get that much ice time win on the Panthers because there were many fantastic players in front of him on the depth charts. When it comes to the San Jose Sharks, but there's Couture, there's Hurdle, that's about it, meaning he's likely going to be playing in that top 6 and perhaps even on that top power play consistently, really allowing him, if he manages to stay healthy, to perhaps really find his game back like he had a couple of years ago. So if the Sharks can get him to like a 50-point player, if not even more than that, a move at the trade deadline is very likely, and they can perhaps get like a 2nd round pick or a pretty good prospect, which would absolutely be better than the 5th round pick that they essentially gave up to get him, since Lorentz doesn't necessarily hold a ton of value. Now, this is indeed a risky deal because, of course, it is possible that Duclair not only doesn't really rebound in terms of his performance, but perhaps even is still kind of injured, not 100% healthy, meaning he has an even worse than expected season, and the Sharks are unable to move him at the deadline. But even in that risky situation, the Sharks are only really out a 5th round pick, so yet again, this is another low risk but high reward type of deal from Mike Grier. It's not like necessarily a massive reward unless Duclair does exceptionally well, but being able to trade a 5th round pick for what could end up being like a 2nd round pick is actually some pretty good piece of business. Now, we obviously cannot completely ignore the fact that theoretically Duclair could be a player that the Sharks want to keep on the roster. He is relatively young, that he does in some ways fit into the Sharks window of competitiveness, which is, a couple of years out. He's only 27 years old, but realistically, I doubt Duclair is necessarily going to be wanting to sign long-term with San Jose, and is probably looking to get back onto a competitive team like the Florida Panthers as quickly as possible. So I would say 90% chance he gets moved at the deadline if he actually does rather well. But of course, we cannot ignore that possibility. So in the end, I would say honestly a pretty solid trade from a Sharks perspective, and hopefully is a good sign of things to come for the rest of this offseason. Class dismissed.